Welcome back once again. My name is John Van Etten, the Managing Director of Human Synergistics Office in Germany. Welcome back to another one of our weekly webinars. Today's topic has to do with industry-specific profiles. So what do we find in terms of using our organizational level tools like the OCI to measure culture, not only in organizations, but across industries? And what kind of differences do we see? And this is a very, very common line of inquiry from clients who are interested in using our tools. Usually the way this question arises has a lot to do with norms. So in terms of our instruments, there's oftentimes a question of, do the norms, or is the instrument really relevant in terms of our specific industry? So this is something that Human Synergistics has been looking into for decades, part of the original reliability and validity testing of the OCI. It was done to look specifically at the consistency of this kind of data across industries. So it's one of also the sort of counterintuitive messages that we have when we look at organizational culture. Usually when I talk about these topics, at least 80% of it seems fairly straightforward, fairly intuitive. But industry differences are one that oftentimes surprise people, at least in terms of the bottom line message that we really don't find significant differences in this kind of data across various industries. Now, this has a lot to do with really what we're measuring and how we're measuring that in terms of organizational culture, having obviously much more to do with the psychological patterns and behavioral patterns of your people, really regardless of what industry your people may be working within. In any case, it is frequently a question from clients. So I remember speaking with Dr. Cook about this topic when he was originally doing research on the OCI. And as I recall, his initial research found that less than 2% of the variance within current culture profiles were something that was predicted by the industry of the organization. So really having a very, very minor impact. Thankfully, over the years, many other researchers have looked into the same question using other methodologies. And interestingly, and perhaps positively, they very much find the same sorts of things. So I point oftentimes to the Globe study of organizational culture and leadership, very, very good research reference on organizational culture and leadership around the world, and also looks at the question of how culture differs across industry. And thankfully, they also confirmed our findings in terms of right around less than 2% of that variability, again, being predicted by industry. Again, that seems to be quite counterintuitive on the surface level to many of our clients. Oftentimes, people believe that we need a different kind of culture in a financial organization than we need in an educational organization, and so on. And to some extent, that may be true depending on sort of how we're defining and measuring these things. But again, the way I like to describe this is, really we're measuring the human factor within the organization. And when we look at how people approach their work within the business and work with others, those patterns of behavior are far more strongly influenced by things like organizational climate than they are by industry. So I guess in short, it really doesn't matter if the sign outside the building is for a bank or for a university or for an engineering company. What really is shaping and influencing your people's behavior in that organization is how their jobs are designed, the behavior, their leadership role models, what we reward and recognize, how goals are set, those things that really affect people on a day-to-day basis as they work to carry out their jobs. Good. So another nice way to look at this is to actually look at data across industry. So the first message really is that we don't find significant differences across industries in terms of the patterns of culture. What drives culture is not the industry, but again, more relevant immediate factors like leadership and job design and those sorts of things. But thankfully, we can show this. And one of my favorite ways to show this is using something that we call industry profiles. So if I share my screen, then I should jump over to a page where we begin showing industry profiles. So we have these across several industries. This one is starting off with communication industry profiles. So thankfully, human synergistics also includes demographic questions in our surveys about industry, as well as many other questions. And this allows us over time to look at whether these differences exist and to create interesting comparatives like this one. So what this is really looking at initially is the communications industry. And what we're trying to show is that essentially whether culture within that industry has the same kind of effect that we describe broadly. So on the left-hand side, what we're looking at are organizations within the communications industry, which currently have predominantly constructive profiles. So again, within the communication industry, the most constructive cultures on the left versus essentially the more defensive cultures on the right-hand side. Then what we're doing below is looking at how those organizations scored across our standard outcome performance criteria. How clear are people's roles? To what extent do people feel they're able to fit in? Think differently, be creative. How satisfied are they? Do they intend to stay in the organization? How do we serve customers? Those kinds of criteria. And what we can see quite clearly is that the organizations within that industry that have more constructive cultures are scoring more positively across all of these indices than are organizations within that industry with less constructive and more defensive cultures. So again, showing very much that culture does matter within that industry, definitely has an influence on their performance and the well-being of their people. And that again, more constructive patterns tend to predict quite consistently more positive scores. So we show that same kind of data across a variety of industries. Now we're looking at consumer electronics profiles, education industry, financial organizations, government, and so on. Again, the pattern is quite consistent, at least in terms of the more constructive the culture is, the more positive we score on outcomes. And again, the primary purpose of these pages is to illustrate that the instruments do function, and perhaps more importantly, that in fact, yes, constructive behavior does predict and drive positive outcomes and performance, while increased levels of defensive behavior unfortunately have the opposite effect. So I find these very helpful. Again, we don't have different norms by industry because we're not finding those significant differences, but we oftentimes can illustrate to clients how these tools are appropriate using these pages. Okay. All right, so this is sort of one way to look at industry feedback. Again, does the instrument function? Are we still able to measure culture within those industries? And does culture really have the kind of consequence and impact that we describe? And again, we can show that across a variety of industries. And this is not all of them. We have even more. I know we oftentimes I refer to military. We have an industry profile for military organizations as well. So those are interesting. So if you're looking for an industry that we don't have shown or I haven't shown, please let us know. We can probably make that happen. The other way to look at this is not necessarily based on the current culture, but the other question I really have quite frequently is actually with reference to the ideal. So, do organizations in the financial industry, what do they describe as being ideal and appropriate for their culture? What is described in educational organizations and so on, again, across industry? Are there differences in what people within various industries describe as ideal and appropriate for their culture? So this is moving forward. We're looking at ideal descriptions, and again, across various industries. If you've gone through a culture accreditation with me, then you know that we do tend to find very high levels of consistency in ideal profiles. Again, sort of regardless of what the industry is or the task is that we are doing, we as human beings tend to function most effectively, learn, collaborate, be able to work towards goals most productively when we're using primarily constructive behavior. So really, we're not describing the ideal industry profile. What we're really describing is the ideal patterns that human beings get work done And this is a lot of the reason that there's so much consistency across these profiles. So again, starting with communications and just sort of flipping through, you can really see those very strong constructive styles, typically at or beyond the 90th percentile, while all of the defensive patterns are typically below the 50th percentile. Very, very clear consistency. Below each of the profiles, by the way, we're also asking what we call readiness for change questions. These are very helpful as well. So not only are people describing, again, in these industries what should be taking place, but we're further asking questions along the lines of if your organization actually moved toward that kind of culture, the ideal that you just described, would working within this kind of culture in your industry enable you to maximize your contribution, enhance the quality of products, work more efficiently? Would this require teamwork, be consistent with mission, be practical and realistic, increase your commitment, and so on? And typically what we see with these kinds of descriptions is that, again, not only are people describing constructive behavior as ideal, appropriate, and positive across industry, but they're also describing that that behavior would enable and allow them to perform at their best, again, solve problems most effectively, be more committed, serve customers effectively, and so on. So those are all of our historic, I guess I should call them historic, industry profiles thus far, because recently Dr. Buglarski in the US, who's also in our research team, has published a new paper and even newer research on this topic as well. So I'm going to try to switch us over to our website, where you can see her article that was published not too long ago on the topic of challenging industry assumptions and unveiling cultural similarities. So really focused on, again, that question of is our industry different? And how that applies to the instruments, and really what we find in data. So wonderful article here. I'll post a link to this in the chat for all of you. It does a very nice job of explaining, of course, what we actually find in data, how that might be challenging to sort of the assumptions that we may have about culture, and also providing with newer data across these industries. So these profiles are have been updated with newer data. I think with more globally balanced data sets, and we're still finding very much the same thing. Those organizations with more constructive cultures across every industry are in fact performing more highly than organizations within those industries with less constructive and more defensive behavior. So nice to see that we've readdressed that topic, pulled up some newer data, found in fact the same patterns that we've been seeing historically, and also have a nice article here to help describe and explain why this is, and how the OCI is in fact relevant to measuring organizational culture and appropriate for doing so across organizational industry. Good. So I hope that is hope that's helpful. It's again a topic I talk about in culture accreditation, but sometimes it's nice to have that as a refresher, and also a video that we'll post on our site, so that when people have that common question about industry differences, they can ask that to us directly. The other point I would make about industry is that oftentimes when leaders are thinking about their industry, they're really thinking about that in terms of the fact that different industries have different outcomes. What we're trying to achieve in terms of performance differs radically across industries. Many industries like transportation and train and rail and aviation, it's, performance is a lot about things like safety, reliability. Financial organizations have different performance criteria, manufacturing, and so on. So what is helpful for industries as well is to customize the outcome criteria that we're measuring in these tools, building in custom questions to get at the performance that is appropriate for your business in your industry. And then again, using the tool to measure that culture and run some analyses to understand, again, not only what the culture is in our industry, but in our business, but specifically how that's driving our performance criteria so that we can, again, understand not only where we are and how that's affecting us, but moving forward, what kinds of things we might want to change within the organization's culture, role model and leverage as leaders to create the kind of performance in our industry that's most relevant. So that's a very helpful way to customize projects to target the purpose of your industry and your organization. Well, then, I think that's all I had for you today. Thank you very much for joining in. Again, this will be posted on our site, so hopefully this will help people moving forward when they have that question around industry differences. And yeah, thank you very much for taking part. It was great.